I'm Jacoby, and today we're going to take a walk through Jacoby history, so let's get into it. All right, so here's an example of a bunch of Dad's very early cues. So Dad started selling cues in 1982, and we lived on a hobby farm at the time on Brickyard Road. And he actually started building cues about 1983. So in 82 to 83, he was only buying and selling Viking cues, and then in 1983, Gordy Hart sold him a lathe, and these are some examples of cues that Dad had first built on that lathe in 83. You can tell by the rubber stamp. So at the bottom of the cue, you'll see a rubber stamp of Jacoby, the little Jacoby guy with JC initials underneath it. If a cue has this stamp on it, it was amongst the first 20 cues ever built. All of these cues were built with parts he got from Eckes, which is a cue maker in Marshfield. So you'll notice there's a lot of these pearl rings, a lot of pre-cut rings that he had purchased from Eckes. The woods are all really domestic to Wisconsin. A lot of them came from friends and family, like some ash and some black walnut. All of them have 5/16 18 or 3/8 10 pins. And he had only built about 20 cues at the time with that JC underneath that stamp. So this is the very first cue that my dad had ever built. He actually made it for his dad, so my grandpa. And this second cue is an example of a cue that he made for his sister, so his sister Dawn. So at the time, he was building all of his cues for just family and friends. All right, here are two examples of cues built from about 1985 to 1988. You can tell by the Jacoby stamp, there's no JC at the bottom. So if that has a Jacoby stamp with no JC, that's from about the 20th to about the 200th cue ever built. It's kind of a funny story. He actually removed that JC because people kept asking what the JC meant, and he was just tired of people asking, so he cut the JC off the stamp and then just went with this singular stamp of the Jacoby guy. Again, a lot of the cues were made from woods that were, from friends, family, and locally sourced. All of the different parts and components, again, were still parts from Eckes in Marshfield. A lot of the cues, almost all of the cues in that era were wrapped with a nylon wrap, where now they're Irish linen and leather. But at the time, nylon was very popular. Most of the ferrules were a vulcanized fiber ferrule at the time. Same thing with his first beginning cues. And again, that was a lot to do with where he was buying the parts and who he was associating with. So Eckes cues at the time were building cues with a lot of fiber ferrules. So at the time when he was building the cues with just the Jacoby stamp, he did start his business, and he called it Dave's Cue Service, and he started it with my brother. My brother at the time was about 16 years old. At the time that he was building these cues, I was about 11. We had built these on our local farm, and then in 1986, we moved to our Nakusa house, where my mom still lives today, and he continued to build cues in the basement. At the time that he was building this vintage of cue, he was starting to actually sell them, but he was selling the cues for about $10 to $20 on average. So just dabbling in it was just strictly a hobby. So here's some example of cues built between 1988 to 1991. And you can tell because they were all signed with just DLJ, so he discontinued doing the rubber stamp. You'll also notice that he transitioned into Irish linen wraps. Again, was building a lot of cues from parts from Eckes, so you can see there's a lot of things that are very similar to a lot of his earlier cues. He was started to do some points, but he was buying points from Burton, Spain at the time, a famous blank builder out of Chicago. This cue here in the middle is actually the first cue that my dad built for me when I started playing pool. So I started playing pool when I was about 13 years old. And when I was 14, only someone from the Midwest can probably understand this, but I detasseled corn and worked all summer to save up money to buy a cue. I nagged my dad endlessly to build me a cue. And, just like most parents, he just kind of dismissed building me a cue. So I detasseled corn all summer. I bought a Mucci Gambler cue. And then lo and behold, then he actually built me my first cue. And I played with this cue until I was about 1991, until I was 16 years old. And that's when I then transitioned in and I built my very first cue, was in 91. But any cue that you see with that DLJ, there's only about 150 of those cues in existence. And they were built between 1988 and 1991. I also want to point out here in 1988, Dad changed the business name from Dave's Cue Service to Jacoby Custom Cues. And in this time period, he was still working at the paper mill. So he had a very good job at the paper mill and just did the cue making as a hobby. Our Jacoby family has a long history of military service. My grandfather served in World War II. My dad served in Vietnam. My brother served in Desert Storm. I served in the National Guard in Field Artillery as a 13 Echo, a cannon fire direction specialist. My brother Shane served in the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, and he was stationed in Savannah, Georgia. He was called into service for Desert Storm, served in Desert Storm, and when he returned back stateside, my dad had built this cue for him. My mother hand painted all the logos on the cue. At this time, my brother, being stationed in Savannah, Georgia, became friends with another famous cue maker, Keith Josie. And Keith Josie actually started to teach my dad how to spray traditional clear coat, like an automotive clear coat. And this cue here is really important to our family. All right, here's an example of the first cue that I had ever built for myself. So this is 1991. I was 16 years old. It's all Purple Heart and ebony. This was constructed from Prather parts. So we had been introduced to Jeff Prather. All of our cues in the vintage of 1991 to 1997 were done with inlays that were provided from Jeff Prather, or we started to do a lot of hand pantograph work. So we had a lot of simple geometrical shapes that we were inlaying with our hand pantograph. A pantograph is a type of tool where you trace a pattern and there's an arm that mechanically moves to mimic the pattern that you're tracing. So in approximately 1992 to 1993 is when we built our shop along our house on Ranger Road. We'd moved all of the cue making from our basement up into that shop alongside the house. In 1991 to 1995, the vintage of those cues would have not had a signature or any logo on the bottom, but they would have had a very similar style to cues done in the previous years. My cousin Phil Hamilton also worked in the shop between 1992 and 1994. He went to school at Mid-State Technical College through the machine tool program and had a great influence in our career. We incorporated our business in 1996 to Jacoby Custom Cues Incorporated. Okay, here's an example of a cue that was built between 1991 to 1996. It would have had a signature on it, or potentially no signature, would have no marking at the butt. So in 1997, we started engraving the cues with the hand pantograph, where we'd mark them with a Jacoby. Any cue prior to that would not have had any engraving on the bottom. This is an example of a cue where the inlays were done with a hand pantograph, and you could use it for inlay work. A lot of engraving was done with hand pantographs. Here are some examples of cues that we built between 1997 and 2007. You'll notice that there was an engraving of Jacoby with our hand pantograph. You can see it runs vertically. At that time, we did start signing the cues. You will find some cues that were engraved but also not signed. But for the most part, they were engraved with this hand pantograph logo and had some hand signature up top. I did buy our first CNC in 1998, and you'll see then that the inlay work then started to transition from what you would typically see in the early vintage to a little more complicated geometry, a little bit different inlay patterns. In 1999, we moved our shop from the house on Ranger Road to Market Street, where we're currently located now. In 2007 is when we changed our engraving from this hand pantograph look to where it has the Jacoby, the opposite direction, horizontal, in the script. Here's an example of another cue that we built for my brother Shane. So we signed it with dedication to him in 2003. After he had passed away, I played with this cue for about 10 years. That's the great thing about cues, that they're more than just an object. A lot of times it has a lot of personal meaning. Here's an example of a cue that you would find typically between 2007 and 2021. The Jacoby would be horizontal instead of vertical. It would also be signed with my dad's signature and also a date. Underneath the bumper, it would be marked with a serial number dating the cue. This particular cue is actually the cue that my dad played with up until he passed away, and now I've continued to play with this cue now in his memory. In 2021 is when we changed ownership and I purchased the company from my dad. This would be an example of a cue now with the Jacoby would be horizontal again, and it would actually be signed with my signature and the date. I just want to show how much it's transitioned over the years. So here's an example of the first cue that my dad had ever made for his dad through to what we currently make now. Here's an example of a series of shafts that we've developed over the years. So this first one is our first carbon shaft that we built in 2002, and we called it the Jacoby Advantage. There's only about 20 of these in existence. We painted it white because we thought that people wouldn't want to buy a shaft that was black. But here's an example of that Jacoby Advantage shaft. This is our Edge Hybrid. This shaft here we built between 2010 and 2017. Then it transitions into our Ultra shaft, which we've built between 2017 to current times. Our black shaft, we started in 2019 until current. And our KW shafts, which we started in 2022 until now.